Hey everyone, how's it going? Glad to have you here at UJug. Once again, we're coming to you from various places. I'm out here in the Twilla area. Venkat's back at home. At least I assume he's back at home. You never know. So this month, we've got Venkat, of course, and he will be giving us an objective comparison of Angular, React, and Vue. And of course, we've got sponsors. I know we've got Brian here from STG. We've probably got some others in the chat. If any of the sponsors are here in the chat, feel free to wave your hand, let yourself known or be known, and a couple of other things to be aware of. We've got a poll down in the bottom. There are actually a couple of polls right now. There will be one going up later on in the evening as well. So feel free to answer those. And I think that covers a lot of the current info. Yep. So I'm going to bring Brian up right now, and he can tell us a little bit about STG. You're up.
Hey, thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. Software Technology Group, longest running UJug sponsor. Just want to say hey to everybody. I've seen a lot of you guys in person. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there. We do have a giveaway later tonight for Amazon gift card and stuff that they'll hand out with the drawing. Had a question asked of us by Dawn, just what the job market was doing. And actually, it's very timely with Venkat's presentation tonight that, as far as Java developers are concerned, 2 years ago, it didn't matter if you had one of these skills in your toolbox. I think it's very important now to have Angular or React, and it was a great addition there as well in your toolbox of things that you can utilize to help you land a job out there. My opinion, future casting of this and looking at things, I think that Docker is going to be in this same boat, and we'll be having the same discussion as far as what tools you should be looking at to expand your skill set going forward. 12 months to 18 months from now, I believe that you're really going to utilize Docker if you're not already in every project that you're doing. Doesn't mean you're going to be a DevOps guy or a SysOps guy, but it's going to definitely be a differentiator as far as somebody picking you versus somebody else. So as far as the job market's concerned, we're actually seeing a lot of hiring. I work in the consulting side of things, and generally when things are a little stable in the market, those are a safer bet for having some projects and some things lined up there. So that's what we're doing. And I raised my hand out there. If you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to discuss with you, or there's a bunch of other recruiters out there as well that would be happy to talk those things with you. But yeah, so if you are somebody that was recently laid off, look at one of the consulting firms that are out there. That seems to be definitely where the market is picking up. We are seeing hiring pick up. And I think one of these front-end technologies is a great one to have, and add Docker in there. So thanks, Jason. I'll turn it back over to you, and we'll get Venkat rolling.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And we've got one other Brian that I'm going to bring up real quick. Brian Hawkins has an after event, kind of quick little breakout session. As soon as he comes up, he can talk about that a little bit. Here we are.
Hey, I'm Brian Hawkins. So right after the main presentation, I'm going to be able to talk to you guys about my favorite topic, metrics. And I've created a small Java library for reporting metrics to back-end time series databases. And I'll spend about 15 minutes introducing metrics for J. So stick around.
Great, thanks. So we've got that afterwards, and of course, let's see what else we got. The upcoming schedule. So next month we have Tim Berglund talking about Kafka. Naturally, exactly what is a little bit TBD. And then in July, you'll note the date change. We have Daniel Hinojosa, and he's going to be talking, doing a nice refresher for some of us, talking about generics. So grokking generics and understanding all of the things like type erasure, covariance, contravariance, all that fun stuff that can be a little bit daunting and trips up even some of us guys that have been using Java for quite some time. Then in August, we have Mark Richards, and he is also TBD. You will note the June and July meetings are also online. We'll see what August brings. although at this particular point in time, we're looking at doing these online for the foreseeable future. We'll see what the rest of the year brings for us. And depending on how it goes for the next little while, if this is something that you all want to see going forward with a crowdcast, then definitely let us know, and we'll be able to do that going forward if that's something that people want to do as well. Announcements. So those that may have missed the news yesterday was Java's 25th birthday. So Java may actually be a little bit older than some of the people here in this meeting, depending on where you're at in your career. So happy 25th to Java. Oracle's been doing a bunch of things to celebrate that. You should be able to find those via simple Google and whatnot. Now, the Utah Food Bank donation, as long as we're going virtual and we don't need to buy pizza, we are making a food bank donation, monetary donation, for the same amount as what we do for pizza every month. So we're able to help out the community in that regard. The door prizes that we've got typically, we have the 2 JetBrains licenses, the Agile Learner subscription. That is Venkat's own website. So that is a 1-year subscription that he's donating to us so that we can raffle it off. And then STG is also donating a 3-month Pluralsight subscription, and as Brian mentioned, a $50 Amazon gift card. So we have those as well. So we're looking forward to that. And I believe that should do it for everyone. Those that are here for the first time, let me make you aware of a couple little housekeeping items. There is an ask a question down on the bottom. I will also be looking at the chat and promoting questions. Venkat said he's happy to take those as they come. So when there's a question, I'll come in during an appropriate time and let him know that there is a question. I also have the opportunity to bring people up on the stage, so to speak. If you're interested in that and have a webcam all set up and whatnot, then we can do that. If you are interested in doing that, just let me know in your question as well, and we can go from there. So I believe, without any further ado, we will bring on Venkat. So he should be popping up on screen in just a minute, and we'll get things going.
Hey, Jason. Good to see you. Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. Thank you, and greetings to everyone in Utah. I always enjoy the visit to your beautiful user group. I can't be there in person for good reasons now, of course. Always a pleasure to speak at this user group. I'm going to talk about an objective comparison of Angular, React, and Vue, and talk about what are some of the pros and cons. I'm not going to give you an answer as to which one to pick, because I never like to give an answer that universally says here's the right thing to do, because I believe there is no such answer. However, I'm going to give you enough details so you can make your own choices based on what may actually make sense for your own projects. Well, before we get going, Jason, if I may ask you, are you a Pepsi kind of a person or a Coke kind of a person?
You're asking me, and I don't drink soft drinks.
Well, if you were to pick one.
Probably Pepsi.
Okay. Well, there's also Mountain Dew now. Well, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Which one to pick if you were to pick. And your answer is actually a good one. Not picking any one of them is probably not a bad idea either. Well, that's kind of what I want to focus on today. I'm hoping you're able to see my screen here. We're going to talk about the reasons we look at these frameworks and libraries, first of all, and then we'll talk about, look at a small example of some code written in all of them, just to kind of be honest about it. We're not going to exploit a lot of features of these libraries or framework because that's a lot of stuff to see in one shot. But I'll give you an introduction to the basic idea and the approach we take in each one of them. And then we'll dive in and compare them. And good time for you to ask any questions or make any comments is any time along the way. I would rather listen to you and interact with you rather than speak to a blank screen. So absolutely don't hesitate to ask questions or make comments. I don't consider it as an interruption at all. I welcome any kind of interaction in between. So with that said, what are we really trying to do? Well, if you look back a few years ago, we were building applications with HTML and JavaScript. Well, we continue to still do it, whether it's JavaScript or TypeScript, it really doesn't matter. But a while ago, we were developing applications with things like Prototype and Scriptaculous. Some of us may remember those days. Then all of a sudden, we switched over to using things like jQuery and left behind those days of Prototype. And then suddenly, people don't want to use jQuery. Now they are using other libraries and framework. And what are the predominant ones today? There are quite a number of them available today, actually. To be honest about it, there's more than the 3 of them that are available, but these 3 seems to be quite popular. But what do we really do with these libraries, frameworks, or platforms? What is the objective? Well, the first thing really is we want to be able to really build interactive web applications. That's the real goal, is to build interactive web applications, rich applications. Now, when it comes to building rich applications, what does it really mean to build rich applications? At the end of the day, it really comes down to 2 things, if you will. And developing modern web applications literally boils down to 2 things. One is manipulating the DOM, and plus the use of Ajax to make remote calls and get the data. So when everything is said and done, that's exactly what we do: manipulate the DOM and get data from Ajax through Ajax. Now, if we are looking at an application, you could be building a traditional application, or we could be building a single page application. A lot of us want to build a single page application. Now, all these tools that we're going to talk about today are definitely useful and are focused on building single page applications. Now, when it comes to building these, what do we really want to do? I mentioned about jQuery a while ago. Now, if you really think about the world we live in, I would say that from the programming point of view, there are 2 styles of programming. One is the imperative style, and the other one is declarative style. And notice I'm not saying functional. And the reason I'm not saying functional here is that functional is actually declarative in itself. So a declarative kind of, is a superset of this. Now, I'm not talking just about imperative style of programming and declarative style of programming. I'm talking about imperative style of living and declarative style of living. What do I mean by that? Now, when it comes to manipulating the DOM, how many of us are absolutely thrilled to be manipulating the DOM? I doubt it. If I was there in presence, I asked people to raise the hand. I really doubt if many people have raised the hand, hardly anybody, in fact. Well, why is that? If you've never manipulated the DOM, maybe the first time you do it, you are intrigued. After one day of spending time manipulating the DOM, you will quickly come to a realization that the job of manipulating the DOM should be given to people in the prison. Nobody in the free world should be forced to manipulate the DOM. It is that tiring and boring. And it's almost impossible for us to remember all the APIs and all the syntax and all the properties and all the things. My gosh, that's just impossible. And it becomes really time consuming. It becomes very difficult, and it becomes error prone. So there are so many reasons why that's not a good idea. Well, in that regard, I want to draw a little bit of an analogy in here, if you will. Let's talk about driving cars. I know a lot of us are not driving that much these days, but we're going to be driving quite a bit. But when it comes to driving, one of them is the stick shift, and I still haven't understood why any human will ever subject themselves to really drive a stick shift. This just doesn't make any sense to me. There are better things to do in life than to sit there and keep pushing this clutch over and over. And I will guarantee you that you may see me do a lot of things in my life, but you will never, ever catch me drive a stick shift. Well, driving stick shift is the most imperative style of living, if you will. And in the programming world, the equivalence of using a stick shift really is manipulating the DOM with hand. This is really a bad experience. Now, on the other hand, what is a little bit palatable is auto transmission. Well, this is not that bad if you really think about it. Now, auto transmission really is, you still have to drive, you still have to keep your eyes open. That's not going to go away. And you still have to put that in drive and press the accelerator. You could put on cruise, but you still have to, keep your hands on the wheels. And it turns out this is still imperative style of living. Now, how is this translating to the programming world? Well, that is using jQuery. Well, jQuery is a morphin. It reduces the pain, but it doesn't remove the disease. You still have to deal with it. You're just learning a higher level of API, but you still have to work with the API. You got to still remember it, and you still have to work through it. Well, over the past few years, have kind of become a little bit detached from driving. And I'm sure you would appreciate that, because if I don't drive, I think the streets are much safer. So it's good that I don't drive. So I've become more of a Uber or a Lyft kind of person. And this, I would argue, is the declarative style of living. I go to an airport, I get off the airport, and I flag down an Uber or a Lyft. I order for a pickup, and I just sit in the back seat. And while the driver does what the driver is really capable of and takes me around safely, I focus on what I want to focus on, which normally is to reply to emails or read some code. So this is basically where I don't have to worry about how to get there, but I always tell them where to go, which hotel to go, or which conference center to go. And so this right here is your Angular, is your React, is your Vue, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. Is we are trying to create a higher level of abstraction, so we don't have to manipulate the DOM directly, not even use an API to manipulate the DOM, but simply say, hey, here's the DOM, here's my data, you take care of it. Now, how this happens is where the rest of the story is. And in just like everything else, just because I take Uber doesn't mean everything is easy. I go internationally, and there are times I've been stuck in foreign countries where I may wait for Uber driver for 30 minutes, or they keep saying they're somewhere, I cannot find them. Well, there's complexities involved as well. Life is never perfect. And so dealing with these frameworks and libraries can lead into complexities and issues on their own merit as well. Sometimes it feels like we're trading one set of problems for another set of problems. That may be true as well. So in that regard, this is really about creating a single page application. It's about manipulating the DOM. It is really about making AJAX call to get the data from the server. And that's basically what we are trying to do. But what is really common between these applications, or rather libraries and frameworks? And that's part of the commonality. All of them, all the three of them and a few more, are really intended to create single page applications. That's what they really are for, even though you could create rich, multi-page applications with them as well. They are really for manipulating the DOM. They really are for getting the data from the server and giving that to the user so the user can interact with it and view the data and manipulate it and then work with the application. Now, that is the commonality. But what is really different between these applications? And the difference is huge in terms of not only how we do things, and in also terms of how we organize the code, how we work with the code, the APIs, the libraries. A lot of these things are different. And we're going to look at what these differences are as we go through some examples. So let's start with a little example and look at a very small example of creating an Angular application. All the three applications are going to do exactly the same. Now, as you know that Angular, Vue, and React are client-side application libraries, but we need a server side. And I was kind of thinking, what can I use for a server side? I could use Java to create a server side. I could use Python. I could use Ruby. I could use, it really doesn't matter. You can use anything you want to build your backend. And so I said, what if I just use JavaScript to build the backend? So I'm using Node, but Node is painful to to use directly. So I created a project using Express. Express is a library on top of Node and JavaScript that serves as a server side. My Express code is very light. It doesn't do a whole lot. My Express code is just spitting back a list of books. I got the title of the book, the author of the book, only one single author, and the price for the book. Now, this particular Express application is going to give us these 3 pieces of data for a couple of different books. And what I did really was something absolutely silly. If you are using a CLI, a command line interface to create these applications, how do you really deal with it? I'm a very simple person. I don't think in complex terms. I try to find solutions that are easier to use. So this is what I literally did. I first of all ran the Express generator, and that created an Express project. And then I literally, on the directory, one level above, I ran the CLI, and that literally dumped the particular library code, whether it's Angular or Vue, on top of that project itself. So that way it merged the two and brought the code back together. And then I did a little bit of tweaking, and now my client side is running on my server side code without much effort at all. The whole thing took me about 5 minutes for each of these things to get set up and get going. Let's talk about what I'm going to display. What I'm going to display is the same for all the applications. At the top, I'm going to say what library or framework I'm using. I'm going to list books, and I'm going to click on a book. It's going to tell me the author. It's going to tell me the title. It show me the price. I can change the price, click on an update, and I want to change that on the view in the top. That's it. Nothing really complex at all. How do we go about doing that? Well, let's first of all get down to the very first thing we want to do here, which is to start with Angular. So what I have here is a code directory with 3 different subdirectories. Let's step into Angular to begin with, and I created this Express application called Books, and I merged Angular on top of it. Well, with Angular is a MVC library. It's a model view controller library. If you want to really think about it, if you can think about it as a Spring for JavaScript. Though that is not a really good statement when I'm mentioning it. You could even go to the extent of thinking it's the EJB for JavaScript if you want to think about it, because Spring is literally lightweight compared to what Angular can do. But on the other hand, Angular is extremely powerful as much as it is heavyweight. And we need to be very careful selecting it, because it will allow you to lift a lot of weight, but there is also complexity that's baked into it. So at the very beginning, if you look at this directory, we are going to go to the source directory, and there's the app directory inside of it. But before we do, let's take a look at the index.html file. Now, when you look at the index.html file, this is common between all the 3 libraries or frameworks. I'm going to use the word library interchangeably for a while, just to keep it easier on myself. But when I mean library, until I say otherwise, it doesn't mean literally a library. It could be library, framework, or platform. I will talk about what the differences are later on. So one of the key elements of this is you're going to have an element. And I want you to think about this as a photo frame. Grandma gave us the photo frame because she loves us. And that photo frame is beautiful, and you want to keep that photo frame. But as years go by, you want to change the photo in the photo frame. And you love the photo frame, but you want to change the photo. So think of that as the photo frame with the photo sitting in there. That's literally what a single page application really is, isn't it? So a single page application is you got a page, your photo frame, and you keep changing the component that's going to be displayed within that particular page. And so this right here is where the content is going to come in and go as time goes on. So that's basically this app root. You can call it whatever you want to call it. Typically, when I create applications, I call this contents, and I keep using that word to replace the content over and over. So this is the index.html page, what I like to call as the photo frame, the starting point. And this, of course, is going to be bringing in stuff. But how does that work? Well, Angular works on a process of bootstrapping. So when you bring in Angular, it is going to bootstrap an application to run inside of that. So the very next thing we want to be looking at right now in this is a very top level class in Angular. Angular is extremely structured. And as a result, when you look over here, you go into the app directory, and in the app directory, there's an app.module, and I'm using TypeScript. You can also use JavaScript if you really want for Angular. I've used JavaScript more than TypeScript for Angular itself. But what is a module? A module in Angular, think of this as a house. So you have your house, I have my house, and we have members of the house. Sometimes I may want to refer to somebody from outside my house. So I may having dinner with my family. I may mention my son's name. I may mention my cousin's name. Everybody knows them. But if I want to say, like I was doing a couple of days ago, I often say, when I talk to my family, I say, hey, Don from Utah Jug, or Jason from Utah Jug. And usually I kind of refer to the context they will remember, where they have seen them. Or I would say, Don from the gym. So if we know multiple people, we kind of refer to where they are from, that housing. So module is kind of like a house. And the module has a few declarations. Think of the declarations as registrations. So you are saying, hey, these are the members of my family. I'm registering them. Imports are things you bring from another house. So from the browser module house, I'm bringing the browser. From the forms module, I'm bringing the forms module. From the client HTTP module, I'm bringing the HTTP client module. So you're importing from another family, from another housing. And then you have Bootstrap. A Bootstrap, in the case of Angular, is like the main class that you want to load, if you will. So the Bootstrap is going to be kicked in when the application starts up. Now, remember the photo frame I talked about, which is the app root. So when the Bootstrap pops up, what does that say? It's going to say, hey, I am interested in finding that little frame and replacing the content of that element. So keep in mind that word app root for a few minutes, and we're going to see how the book component is going to deal with it. Now, app component, you could use it if you really want to, and typically your app component may be holding to other components. But one of the really nice things about Angular is really powerful to build an extremely rich user interface. Imagine you're working for a bank or you're working for a store, and a bank wants to introduce new products. For example, they want to introduce a certificate deposit. They want to introduce, as the current situation exists, unfortunately, they want to introduce a PPP loan. They want to introduce other economical packages, and they want to quickly throw things on the screen, but they may want to remove some of them along the way. And you don't want the application to become brittle. You don't want to change something and everything breaks apart. Well, what is nice about Angular is, think of these homes or houses, and you can bring them into your community. So you can say, here's a certificate deposit. Here's my checking accounts. Here's my savings account. Here's my economic packages. And then you can toggle them, turn on and turn off them very easily. You can bring them by using these dependencies. And once you do, you can have them as routes and you can display them very effectively. But for our purpose, let's simply go to the book component. Now, in order to look at the book component, you see the directory called book. And within the book component, you have the book component is the class that you see here. And you also see a book component HTML and a CSS as well. Let's edit the book component .html for a minute. And notice what this is going to do. This says I'm going to display a table of author, price, and the title and the author and the price. And I'm going to give a little button to click on, and I'll come back into the details about this in just a minute. However, if you look at the book and book component .ts, you notice that this component, the book component, it simply says I'm a component, and I am going to contain books that I'm going to display. So these are what are called life cycle events. Life cycle events are when a component, so all the three libraries use components. When a component comes to life, the constructor is called, and then an event happens after the DOM is mounted for that component. And on ng init or ng on init is a function, a lifecycle event. And you don't want to do things in the constructor. This is a good place to make calls to the backend. And you make a call to the backend and say, go do this stuff, and you're making the call. In this case, I call get books. Get books is going to talk to a service, and then it's going to get the response from the service and stick that into the books, which is a model, as they call it. A model is just a field within a component. And then once you do, when the model changes, the view is automatically updated, and that books that you see is the books that you see up here. And you're going to get the collection of the books and iteratively go through one book at a time and display it. Now, in the case of Angular, this is pretty much the structure. You have a module and you have child modules. As you can see in this particular example, you have app at the top, but books. But tomorrow I may be interested in creating maybe music CDs that I want to sell. So I could have books and CDs, or I may have other forms of things, clothing. And these all could be different modules that you can bring in, and modules can come together to form other modules. I'm not diving deep into the modules here, but you get the point. So the first thing to keep in mind about Angular is it's got modules and submodules and modules, and they form a hierarchy and they can come together. I'll talk about more details about this a little later on. Now, when it comes to Angular, there are a couple of things we need to really be comfortable with. The very first thing about Angular is it's extremely structured. And if you think of a browser on one side, and if you think of a server on the other side, there's a lot of stuff that goes on between these two endpoints. Well, the very first thing you're going to see here is the template. This is the view the user is going to interact with. And oftentimes that communicates with, it's a two-way communication typically, and communicates with the component. And so you have a component that you're going to be sitting next to. And with the component given, we can then have something in between, and I'm going to put them right here as called pipes. So what are pipes? Pipes are really transformers. So just to give you an idea about a pipe, let me show you an example here of going into book component.html. Notice that I'm using a pipe right here. I take the price, but I pipe it into a currency filter or a pipe. And it says the number you give me, I'm going to display it in US dollars. That's what it tells us. So that's an example of a pipe. Think of pipe as transformers. This is really based on the Unix model, where you could say, my program, and you could pass it to a cat, and you could pass it to a WC, and so on. So you can pretty much pipe these things in Unix. It's the same idea in Angular. Very powerful. And of course, you have the pipes. Then what you have here is, if your component talks to a backend server, your code becomes very brittle. Tomorrow, you may change from an XML to a JSON format, or you may change the format of the data. You don't want to break multiple components when a format of the data changes. So you typically talk to a service, and that in turn talks to a server at this point. So this is a typical architecture of an Angular application. And then you also have what are called directives. And so what is a directive? I'll put it in blunt terms what a directive is. A directive is a DOM manipulator. That's it. It manipulates the DOM. There are three kinds of directives. Those that completely wipe out a DOM and recreate the structure, those are components. Those that modify the attributes, those are attribute directives. And those that modify the structure, and there are three kinds of directives that Angular provides. So this is kind of the overall. In addition to this, there are routes and routers that you can create. And these are useful for client-side links you can click on. And the way that Angular makes this work is that you have these routes, and depending on where you click, it can bring in different components into a view and swap them out. And the last major part of Angular is what are called dependency injection. This is huge in Angular. Dependency injection is built into the platform, and as a result, you can bring the dependencies. For example, the way that a component depends on a service is not by tight coupling. Instead, you have what are called providers. So think of the providers as things that look up for a particular service based on a name. So here's a way to think about it. You may be interested in taking a soft drink. Maybe you want Pepsi, maybe you want to have Coke. I'm a person who normally doesn't drink soft drinks, but there are times when I may not have much other option, and they will come to me and say, what would you like to drink? And I don't know whether they have Pepsi, I don't know whether they have Coke, and I don't care usually. So I may simply say, get me a soft drink. So provider, here you say, get me a soft drink. Well, you route this provider to an implementation like Pepsi or Coke, or for a particular soft drink, you make that routing and you can configure this in Angular. So tomorrow, if you decide to throw away this particular service and bring a different service because your data format changed, you can do that without changing your component, as long as the two implementations serve the same interface. That's dependency injection, as we all know. Like in Spring or in Juice, very similar idea. So dependency injection plays an extremely important role. In fact, it's so important. If you go a little further with this, you will notice that in the case of the service itself, you will notice the service depends on the implementation by using another level of dependency injection. Notice the constructor right here, and it says bring in me HTTP, which is a HTTP client. But that wiring is done by Angular by looking up the dependencies. Now, if you really think about it, this is mind-boggling, isn't it? So for example, you could say, I want Coke. Where did the Coke come from? Well, from that refrigerator. How did that get into the refrigerator? Then we look at the supply chain. Well, Angular says, don't worry about it. I'll take care of all that wiring. And when you say I want Pepsi or Coke, I'll give it to you. When you say you want soft drink, I'll give it to you based on what it's wired behind the scenes. So dependency injection is everywhere. Part of the reason that's also very important in Angular is because Angular depends on dependency injection a lot for testing. And that's one of the nice things about all the frameworks that we're going to look at here, the libraries, is it's really great for testing. Okay, that's enough talking of what I went through here, just to give you an idea. I want to mention a couple of more things before wrapping this up on Angular and talking about one other library. And that is Angular has a two-way binding. So what that means is you can use a two-way binding where you can modify the view and the data changes in the component. You can change the component and the data changes in the view. Now, the syntax is a little weird, but this is exactly where the two-way binding comes in. Notice that we have a curly. This is called the interpolation. So the interpolation is where you take the data from the component and stick it into the view. That's a one-way binding. On the other hand, when you are interested in manipulating the data, what you can do in Angular is, let's take a look at this example of a book of this here. So if I go to, where am I? So if I go to a source app book and look for the book edit component .html, I'll show you the two-way binding here. Notice this ng model, this square bracket and a parenthesis, and then I say book.price. That's a two-way binding. You change the data, it changes the view. You change the view, it changes the data. Now, in that regard, Angular gives 4 syntax. This is interpolation, so component to view, and you have a parenthesis, which is what you see here in the click. So this is a way for you to take a user's input and fire a method on a component. So this is a view to the component interaction by firing a method on it. A third syntax is a square bracket. This is where you're binding a property to a particular model. So if your model changes, the property value can get reflected based on that. And finally, they have a weird name for it. They call it a banana in a box syntax to make it easy. And this is the only one that is two-way binding. All the other 3 are one-way binding from a component to a view or a view to a component in terms of firing events or binding properties. But the banana in a box is a two-way binding syntax that you get out of this. Well, okay, so that gives us an idea. So what I've done here is when you click on this, I call an update price, and the update price then propagates that event. Oh, that's another thing, which is very powerful in Angular. If you look at the source app book and book edit component, you will notice that I've registered inputs and output. This is very powerful in Angular. So this component, book edit component says, I got an input called book that comes in. Think of a component as a black box. You have an input that says, bring in a book, and I have an output, which is an event emitter of a price change. So when a price changes, I emit the price change to the parent, and that can then take that price change and make a change on its side. Let's see this in working and then move on to the next one. We'll come back and talk about more stuff later on when we have questions or other things to discuss. So let's go ahead and fire this up and see how this is going to work. So go to the directory right here and the books, and I'm going to say npm run build, and that's running ng build. That's what it really does. And that is just bundling all this and compiling that into traditional JavaScript behind the scene from TypeScript, and then making it available for us to use. And then I'm going to fire up Express. And Express, of course, is the backend server. So I do an npm start, and that really started Express, as you can see. Now I go ahead and fire up the browser right now. And what am I going to do with the browser? I'm going to simply go to localhost 3000, and there you see the application we looked at, Angular example. And I click on this edit button. The book here, the price, I'm going to change the price to $11, let's say, and click on update. And you can see the price changed to 11 right there. And again, if you missed it, I change it to 12. It's still 11. I click on the update, that changes to 12. So that's the interaction between the two components. This is the book component. This is the book edit component. Now, initially, that component doesn't exist, but when I click on it, we just brought it in. And that's basically what we did. So that is the Angular example that we saw. Well, Angular is a lot of work. So think of it as something that gives you a lot of power, but you got to put a lot of effort towards that as well. What about Vue? Well, let's take a look at how Vue approaches this whole thing that we saw so far. So in terms of Vue, Vue is the new kid on the block, relatively speaking, compared to all the three of them we talked about. So let's talk about how the Vue is going to handle that. I did exactly the same thing, same application backend, and the front end is different. So
I've got a question real quick.
Oh, yes, fire away. Please,
please. It's a little bit odd, but someone was wondering which IDE you're using.
Oh, I'm using TextMate.
All right.
It's not an IDE, it's just an editor, plain vanilla editor. If people are curious about TextMate, if they go to agilelearner.com, in Agile Learner, I have a free video that shows how I use TextMate to set up things. I do multiple languages using TextMate. It requires registration, but it's a free video. If you don't find it, but if you're curious, drop me an email. I'll be more than happy to show you where it is. My email address is on line number 4 if you want to take a photo of the email address. So what about Vue? So with Vue, if you look at Vue, Vue takes a simpler approach, relatively speaking. And in that regard, if I go to the source directory, you notice the app.vue sitting here. And let's take a look at what app.vue is doing. So there is the template at the top, and the template says, I'm going to display Vue example. And remember the analogy I used, the metaphor of photo frame. That's your photo frame right there. So the photo frame says, I want to display stuff in here. So in this case, it says, I have an ID app, and I want to replace the content with the book list with the content of the book list. Now, book list is a component in Vue that we're going to create. And in this case, the script part says, I am going to be the component called app, and the components I know of are book list that I'm going to use. And here I'm using book list. And there's a style sheet in the bottom. No need to worry about that. Well, the question is, what does the book list actually do? Well, let's take a look at the book list at this point. So if you look at the book list, I'm going to close that. We'll come back to it. So if you look at the book list, that's located on the components directory. And in this directory, there's the book list view. If you look at the book list view, it says my template, I have a table where I'm going to display the book author, title, and price. And Angular Vue also supports two-way binding. And in that regard, there are events you can bind to. So in this case, we said v.bind. V is just a directive, just like Angular directive. These are directives in Vue. And you are saying, I'm going to take the key and bind to this value book.id. I'll talk about what the key is later on. And then, of course, you have the title, author, and price. However, if you notice that vFor, just like in Angular, and then we say book in books, and we are iterating and displaying the row for each of the books. Unlike Angular, where we had this parenthesis click, we have a v on and then a click. So this is v on, and then the event name, and then the action to perform you're providing. In this case, I want to call the edit book function and pass the book, in this case, a copy of the book I want to pass to it. And then you hit down below is your component. And in the component, you have the book list component. And remember the lifecycle event? So right here is the mounted event. This is much like the ng on init in Angular. The mounted event is called after the component is mounted. There's a created event, mounted event, and so on. There's a handful of lifecycle events. That in every library framework, you're going to use these lifecycle events. Now, what do? I use a fetch function, which returns a promise. I make a call to the server, the books URL, and when it returns back the response, I stick that into the variable called books. But what is books? That is available as data. So components in Vue contain a handful of things. They contain data, they contain events, they contain methods, as you can see here. They contain computations. So these are all known things you can put into a component. So the method edit book that you see up here is a method right here sitting, which says, I'll take the book you give me and set it into this field called book to edit. Then what do? Then I say, if the book to edit is available, only then display book edit. Otherwise, don't show it. And when you show the book edit, bind the variable, the property called book in book edit to the book to edit that is available in my component. So you're passing from the property from the parent to the child. This is very similar to how React does things, not how Angular does things. You can see the similarities and deviations now in the spectrum. A little bit like what Angular does, a little bit like what React does. So you're binding this property to that variable. But then here is a binding of the event to that function update price. And what does the update price do? It says, I'll take the price you give me, find the book you want to update, and I will modify this. And because of two-way binding, when you change this price, it'll change the price over there as well. So again, two-way binding like Angular, a little bit of binding of property like in React, and then events like in Angular as well. So just to kind of get a feel for it, let's go take a look at the next one here, book edit view. And what does the book edit view say? It says I have a property called book. And so this is my property that I can receive from the parent. I don't have any data really in this case, but I'm going to take that book and display the title and the author, and the price I'm going to display as an input. And here is the V model. V model is your two-way binding. So if you modify the view, the data changes in the component. You modify the data in the component, the view changes. And then when you click, I emit. This is very much like in Angular. You emit an event, and the parent can receive that event and do the work. Emitting is only part of Angular and Vue. It's not part of React. It does it very differently. But what I want to kind of bring out here is Angular and here is Vue doing a few things like Angular and a few things like React. That's kind of the nature of this, right in the middle, Angular, and then Vue sitting right in the middle. So that's pretty much what we did here. So you have a template where you have the view and you have the book component, book edit component, which contains properties, data, methods, and stuff like that. And then there's a binding of how you take the data in the component and how you display it. And components in both of these, or in all the three of them, form the hierarchy. So as you can see in the view here, we have provided the app, as you can see up here, said, I want to display a book list. The book list over here said, I want to display the table, but I want to display the book edit when the book to edit is available. So you can see the hierarchical structure that you have here. Let's take a look at how this works when we run this code. So let's go back here and fire this up. So again, in Vue, let's go ahead and do npm run build, and that's going to take all the code, compile it down to traditional JavaScript, make it ready. And when it is done with it, I'm going to make sure it's run properly. And then when I finish running it, I'm going to then go ahead and say npm start, again, running the Express server we saw. Now, if I go back over here and hit the refresh, because I shut down the other server that is Vue, and I click on this, and again, you can see the $11, that's $10.99 right now, and click on it, the price changes. So very similar, but a lot less code. Less structure, but even though there is structure, less structure. Let's talk a little bit about how React is going to do this, and then we'll come back to compare and discuss even further. So how does React do the whole thing? Well, let's close this down. Let's go to React at this point. So shut down the server, and here we are going into React. Well, in React doesn't have any structure at all. It's up to you how you want to do things. And so in the case of React, I go into the source directory and notice there's an index.html. That's your photo frame I talked about. So right there is contents, and that part right there is where the content is going to come and appear. So that is the first starting point. And it is going to start into into the source.
We've got another question, Venkat.
Oh, yes, please, fire away.
It says, and this is from, let's see, where did it go? This is from Lee. Lee asks, does book edit update data on the web server side, or is it only on the web app or the browser client side?
Really good question. In all the examples I've used so far, I only get data from the server. I am not updating the data onto the server. There are two things I want to talk about in that regard. One is to push the data to the server. And in the case of Angular, you go through service to do it. In the case of Vue, you can also create a service and go through it, or you can use a fetch like we saw here and send it. But a lot of times also, we tend to use things like Redux, and you may just push the data to Redux, and Redux may send a notification to a service, and the service may push the data to the server. That's one of the reasons I normally don't push the data from components to servers at all. I either push the data from the component to services, and the services push the data to the server, or typically I push the data from components to Redux, and Redux will notify a service, which in turn will send the data to the server. That's basically what I do in all the three libraries, but I'll talk more about that a little later. But keep those questions coming. Definitely, that gives me things to talk about in more detail later on as well. So when you look at the start.js, notice this is extremely simple. Think about it this way. Render, this is what, so this is how, this is what, and where. This is the way I think about it, right? So you're saying, how do you want to render? React, you may render into the HTML DOM. You may do React Native. How do you want to render? Where do you want to render it? I want to render, pardon me, the other way around. I want to render what? I want to render the app component. That's what I want to render. Where do you want to render it? Oh, on that photo frame, look for that contents and render it. This is the most rudimentary form in React. You simply say how to render, what to render, where to render. That's basically what it is. Well, with that said, then we need to look at what the app is doing. So if you look at the app.js, the app component simply says, hey, thanks for calling. I'm going to render the books component. That's it. I'm not doing anything more. Okay, thank you for that. Let's look at the books component at this point. What does the books component say? The books component says that I am going to render a HTML table, and within this, I'm going to render the book author, blah, 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 all those things. But where does this come from? This is very distinctive in React, is React contains what's called a state. Unlike the other two libraries we talked about, React does not do two-way binding. React only does one-way binding. So you take the component and you push it to the view, but not from the view to the component. That you have to write code for. Not a lot of code, but you have to write code for. Now, remember the lifecycle event, ng on init, mounted component did mount. All the three are pretty much equivalent. That function right there is called after the component is mounted, the DOM has been updated. Then you go to the server, get the data. Now, typically, React doesn't care how you do things. This is me trying to introduce some structure into the game. I have a service, and I don't want to be touching the server from the component myself. So I typically create a service in my React applications. So service get books, and when you get the data back, stick that into the state by calling the set state. You should never update the state directly except in the constructor. You should always call set state because set state will trigger the evaluation of the view rendering when the change to the state happens. Then what I have here is an edit book that sets the book to edit to book that I'm going to give. That comes from the view. We'll see that in a minute. And then update price simply says, I'm going to find the book. And notice I'm not making a mutation. I'm making a copy of the book that needs to change and keep all the other books intact and set it back into my state. Now the render, we need to keep in mind, unlike Angular and Vue, these are not regular HTML. They look like HTML, but they're very deceiving. These are called JSX, JavaScript extension. So much like, if you will, notice this word books, notice this word app. Just like how these are components, you need to keep in mind that div, table, tr, all of them are React components. They just have the same name of the familiar HTML components, and they map to HTML, but this is not HTML. These are React components. That's called JSX, JavaScript extension. So you update those, and then of course what you do here is this part. Remember the for loop that you saw in Angular and Vue? There is no such thing in React. Instead, you put this little block of JavaScript right here, and in this you say, I'm going to take the pardon me, I want to show you here. So that curly right there. So you say, I'm going to stick this computation right there, a block of JavaScript, and I'm going to take the books and perform the map, which is the functional style of programming. You do a map, and for every book, you inject a tr, a row. Similarly, here's a block of code. You say if the book to edit is present, display the book to edit. Otherwise, just don't display anything, just a blank. So that's basically how you're bringing the other component. How does the book component then get the work done? Well, if you look at the book edit component, the book edit component says, I'm going to display the title and the author, but I'm going to get them as properties. So notice that props that you see here. And the click on click is an event. And that simply says, I'm going to call an update price that is coming in as a property, and you're just going to fire an event on a method on the parent. There is no event handling features per se in that regard. In more recent versions of React, there are a few more things added to it, but not too complex. So in this case, I have a little flag here that says a reference, and notice I go to that reference and get the current value. You wonder what that reference means. That is a handle into the input that you see right here. So you're able to interactively get the data. Why? Because React doesn't give you the two-way binding. The data simply sits in the input, and you got to go fetch it from there, and you fetch it using this ref. Now, this may look a little odd, but this is fantastic from the point of view of testing. And I've done extensive testing of React applications using Enzyme and Sinon, and this comes in really handy for testing. I have my complete client side fully 100% tested with 100% code coverage without the server running. thanks to the ability to mock by giving these things really nice different parts to it. So how does this work? We'll come back and talk more about these things again later on when we start executing the code, doing the comparison. So let's fire this up and see how this works. So npm again, run build, and I'm just packaging all this into traditional JavaScript. And when we are done with it, let's do npm start. Again, starting the Express server, and I go back to my Vue, and I hit the refresh. That's my React application. And once again, let's change the price to 11, click on the update, and the price changed. So that's basically the output from each one of them. Well, we kind of talked about a few high-level details. There's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about, obviously, but let's talk about some comparisons. And along the way, absolutely ask questions. Please don't wait till the end, and I'll be more than happy to respond right away. So how do they compare with each other? Well, I'm going to come up with somewhat of a crude analogy for comparing these three things. So let me think about, say it in this way. If you think about these three different tools we saw, now when it comes to Angular and Vue, so React is a library. And you can say Vue is a library as well, and tending towards a framework. Angular is actually a platform. Now, what is the difference between a library, a framework, and a platform? What's the difference? A framework. So essentially, a library is what you call into mostly. And maybe the word library is a bit of a stretch in this context, but library is what you call, what you use. And in that regard, I might be more tempted to use the word framework for both of these because they tend more towards a framework than library, but they're pretty lightweight. But a framework normally grows around you. Your code is deployed in a framework or written inside a framework. The framework calls into your code by way of things you implement, whereas a library is what you call into. So these are really more of a framework than library. Angular, on the other hand, was a framework, but now it's a platform because you can configure different parts very easily. Almost everything in Angular can be configured pretty extensively. So from the point of view of library versus framework versus platform, Angular definitely is a platform. The other two are library slash framework. Now, in that regard, in terms of the weight, if you want to think about it, on one end is Angular. On the extreme opposite is React. And Vue, in my opinion, observation, is somewhat in between, and it tends to be going in that direction. I hope it would never get here, but it definitely started somewhere close to here and moving towards that. So this obviously is heavyweight, and this on this other end is definitely lightweight. Now, I'm not saying this negatively. Question. Yes, please.
All right, and this is coming from Steve Park. And Steve asks, does either platform, I'm assuming any of the three platforms here, have a clear advantage when connecting to databases?
You would never want to, well, so if you're talking about a server-side database, you're not going to talk to a server-side database from any one of them. You definitely want to talk to your server, and the server is going to talk to the server-side database. If you're talking about client-side databases, none of the three have any benefits. You're going to use third-party libraries to do that predominantly. And again, I want to emphasize, you don't want to talk to a database directly either. You normally, whether it is a client-side database, that is, you want to talk through pretty much a service that you would write, and then that in turn would probably load the data into something like Redux, and then you want to be able to then have that available to components. Talking from components to data is generally not a good idea in any of these libraries. So as a result, you're not going to get much benefit from any one of them. They're all equally the same in that regard. So in that regard, I'm not saying this negatively as heavyweight versus lightweight. When it is heavyweight, it can lift a lot of heavyweight as well. When it's lightweight, it can do reasonably things nicely, but it won't be able to do everything for you. So it really depends on what you're looking for. So to understand that better, I'm going to come up with absolutely a crude analogy. I'm going to say Angular is more like a cruise ship, if you want to think about it. React, on the other hand, is a sailboat. Now, there are two reasons I love this metaphor. The first reason is because I came up with it. Well, the second reason is I do believe that this actually is a good metaphor. If you are interested in having a nice weekend with a small group of friends and family, you have a nice lake nearby, you want to go out and have a nice cruise, have a quality time, a sailboat is amazing. You can definitely go on a sailboat. On the other, what do you get in a sailboat? A piece of time, good time with family. You can take whatever you want to take with you and you can enjoy. You can take your music with you, but there's a limitation to what you can do with what you have. Cruise ship, on the other hand, is huge. You have theaters, you have music concerts, you have swimming pools, you have absolutely everything you would ever expect. It's like living in a city on a ship. That's your cruise ship. That is Angular. You walk into Angular, you walk into a cruise ship. You want something, it's there for you, mostly. And of course, if what you want is to go on a cruise, you don't want to go into a sailboat. If what you want is a sailboat, you don't want to go get a ticket into a cruise ship, purchase a ticket into a cruise ship. So you have to ask the question, what do I want? Now, there are people who want one or the other, and sometimes they want both at different times. I'm not saying sailboat is better or cruise ship is better. There are times when cruise ship is what you want. There are times when sailboat is what you want. And Vue is right in the middle of those two, trying really to balance between the two. And in that regard, so what is included in the case of these libraries and frameworks and platforms? Well, the first thing is, in the case of Angular, everything is included. You walk into Angular, Angular is highly opinionated. It gives you everything. So if you hire somebody to work on your Angular project, they know exactly how to do things. Hey, I want to talk to the server. No problem. Go talk to the HTTP client module. Hey, I want to filter data and transform it. No worries, do a pipe. Hey, I want to do dependency injection. Not a problem, taken care. Hey, I want to do routing. No worries, that's built in. It's done. So everything is baked in. There is
another
a lot.
question.
Yes, please.
And this is coming from Lee again. He says, does lightweight imply better performance in addition to smaller size?
Not at all. So I'm not going to even talk about performance in terms of this yet. And I'll talk about performance later on. But no, it's all about programming effort to what you get for that effort. So if you have a very, very verbose application to develop, like the bank or the store I talked about, where you got several features you want to throw into the view and you want to manage them, that's enormously complex amount of stuff you want to do. Angular can lift that weight for you and bring that to you. Now, it's very arguable. You can ask me, do I want to build that complexity into my application on the front end? I can spend time discussing that with teams, and I might convince them one way or the other, depending on what we have at hand. But if that complexity is what you want, it's kind of like, if you think about it, you could have a crane to lift something very heavy. Obviously, people like me cannot operate crane. I need to have training to operate a crane. I can take a shovel and move things, quite easily. So, but it can also do only a small amount of work. So heavyweight is where you have to do a lot to get moving, but it gives you a lot more in return as well for what you do. So in that regard, when it comes to what's included, Angular has everything included. The React doesn't have a lot of things included. React is not an MVC library. React is a very lightweight Vue library. It gives you components, it gives you Vue, It allows you to update the view. It allows you to take the data from the view and update the component. You say, hey, React, that's great, thank you. How do I send the data to the server? And React says, that's your problem. Oh, I want to communicate with that endpoint. React says, go for it. I don't have anything to do with it. Hey, React, how do I have a client-side a link? React says, that's your problem, not mine. Now, there are third-party libraries for it. I'm not suggesting that you are left with nothing, but it's not part of the core React library. You will bring in other libraries to do it. Hey, I want to talk to the server. Go figure out what library you want to use. You can use fetch, WG fetch. You can use Ajax calls through other libraries. React doesn't care. Hey, I want to use React routing. React says, do whatever you want to do. I'll be absolutely frank about it. There is a library called React Router, and the word React Router is a little misleading. It's not part of React. It's a third-party library. I've used it in the past, but when I sat down to create a more recent application, I decided not to use it. Not because it is bad. It is because I don't care about bringing dependencies. And I spent maybe about 2 hours, and I was able to devise a very simple way to implement client-side route on my own with React. But on the other hand, you can use third-party libraries to do that as well if you don't mind bringing third-party dependency in. In the case of Vue, there are libraries built into it more recently. That's why I say it's moving in that direction. Vue started with almost nothing, focused on lightweight efforts like React, but as time went on, they started bringing a few more things into it. And Vue has a library to talk to Redux. Vue has a library, API, or module, if you will, to talk to the backend to get the data. It's got a little routing library and things like that. It's definitely not as heavyweight as Angular, but it's also not less featured as React is. So Vue is trying to really maintain this balance between not going overboard and not giving you stuff as well. So they give you a little bit more, but at the same time, they don't go overboard in way of how they implement it. Angular is extremely structured. There are clear places where you put things. There's this modules, there is services, there is components, there is pipes, and there is the structure. You walk into an Angular application, it's beautifully kept. Everything is going to be where you would expect. If you have taken the time to learn Angular, you're like, I know exactly where things are. Let me get down to work. Vue has a little bit of structure. React has no structure. You got to put the structure in. Now, you got to decide where to put things, how to structure them. And over time, different teams have developed different practices. I've got my own as well. And I say, here's where I'm going to put these stuff. Here's where my services are going to be. React doesn't care about services, but I normally use them, and so on. And when it comes to validation, well, in the case of Angular, there is not a whole lot of fail-fast approaches. You have to be responsible for validation yourself. Even though it's TypeScript, fair enough, you'll get compilation errors during compilation because it's TypeScript, or if you're using JavaScript, you don't get that. But still, there are failures that will happen at runtime, and you need to look for it. Vue does some kind of handling, but not enough, in my opinion. React, on the other hand, surprisingly, does a little bit more in terms of error handling and validation. In the case of React, you can spend the time and specify what kind of data format you're expecting, and you can put rules around it, and it won't fail like a compilation failure, but it will give you the errors on the console, and you can quickly look at them and you can fix them. When it comes to DOM, there are two kinds of DOMs that are available. The first one is a real DOM, and the second one is a virtual DOM. If you don't mind, I want to spend a minute just illustrating this for us in here. So let's go to the browser. Let's go ahead and bring up, and I'll show this a little bit few times so you don't miss it when I go through it too quickly. But let's go to the Angular application really quickly. Let's do npm start to fire up the server. Let's go over here, refresh this, and I want you to take a look at this elements right here, and I'm going to bring in this part right in here. So right inside of this, as you can see, well, deeper into this, I'm going to actually just dive into this part right here so we can actually see it. Well, when you look at this part right here, if I click on the edit, you can see this right here, and I'm going to then look at that part. And right there is the book. And within that, you can see all this data sticking up right in here with this. I'm going to leave this here. But I want your eyes to be here. Look at the bottom part while I click on the edit. Now, when I click on the edit, what you notice is the title is changing and the author is changing and the price is changing. So if you notice, most of the libraries are getting towards that, where they try to minimize the amount of change that happens to the view. So a difference between a virtual DOM and real DOM is where a real DOM is simply a plain DOM, and you wipe it out and then you re-inject the DOM entirely. And Angular used to be that way a lot. React, on the other hand, was doing virtual DOM. And what it means by virtual DOM is, let's come to that in just a minute. If
We've
you
got
go,
another question. This is from Mohan. He says, which platform has more popular ecosystem and which one integrates well with other capabilities like chart and graphs?
You know what? I would say all of them are pretty popular and powerful, almost to the equal level. There is a lot of activity in all of them. I don't think it's possible to say one stands out than the other, because a substantial number of developers are using every one of them. And keep in mind, a lot of these libraries are just JavaScript libraries. You can integrate them into almost any of these. So there is really not that much of a distinction in that terms in general. So here is, I'm going to start the Vue, and going back to the Vue right now, here's the Vue application. And I dig into this part again. And if you notice, here is the table sitting here. Let's go ahead and take a look at this span. And inside of that is, again, you can see who moved the cheese. And keep your eyes on this part. I click on it. You can see what is changing at this point. And if you see, it is literally changing the elements that are modifying. It's not blowing away the entire div and recreating. That's again where it selectively knows to modify just the DOM elements, which is exactly what you're going to see when it comes to React as well, because all these things are geared towards giving a reasonable performance. Now, having said that, I also firmly believe that this is a bit overblown in terms of performance. And I'll tell you why that is in just about a minute. So going back to this is the React application. Again, let's go ahead and dig into this part to look at this view. And if you notice over here, this is going to contain the elements, as you can see. And then, of course, I'm going to be toggling that. A very similar approach, as you can see, in terms of what is actually changing. So, but having said that, when you are dealing with these libraries, sometimes people will tell you virtual DOM is awesome because it gives you better performance. I honestly think it's overblown. And the reason I think it's overblown is twofold. When you have a lot of data, when I say a lot, it is going to be really into tens of thousands of data. That's when you might actually see a difference. Secondly, even if you were to do that, when your DOM is empty, when you fire up so many elements to be inserted, you're not going to get any performance benefit of virtual DOM because you don't have anything to selectively update because the whole darn thing is empty. I've actually had clients who come back with performance problem in any of these three and say, my gosh, it's really slow on load up. Yeah, it is slow on load up because there's nothing to leverage. You don't have selective update because there's nothing to selectively update. So what we have done for them is sit down and do fetching of data in increments, much like pulling a little bit of data at a time and then populating the DOM in increments. So we amortize the cost of loading the DOM. And virtual DOM is helpful in some places, but not always. So we got to be careful about it. Now, having said that, when it comes to HTML versus JavaScript, in the case of Angular, you are using plain HTML. In the case of Vue, you're using HTML. In the case of React, you're using JSX, the JavaScript extension. So in effect, you have to ask the question, do you want to put HTML into JavaScript file, or do you want to put JavaScript into HTML file? In the case of Angular, you put JavaScript into HTML. But to be fair, when I used Angular, I keep the JavaScript in HTML extremely minimum. I would write functions in my component, and I would call those functions from HTML, so my HTML doesn't get bloated with JavaScript. When I work with developers, if I find them writing more than one line of JavaScript at a point, I would ask them to refactor it. So by good discipline, you can keep it minimum. In the case of Vue, you can keep the templates separate. You can keep the JavaScript separately. So that gives you a little bit more control. But still, you're using some JavaScript in HTML. React is probably the worst of all in that regard. Well, again, with proper discipline, we can reduce the pain. I actually work with developers where I would open up React and their render function will be this monster of 1,000 lines of JSX. I cringe when I look at it. I always encourage my developers to refactor and make smaller components. It not only becomes easier to maintain, it becomes easier to test as well. So it's extremely important to componentize this properly. Of course, in this case, you're using pure HTML in Angular and Vue. You're using HTML extensions, the JSX JavaScript extensions in React. Native support, React does a fairly good job. You have to use third-party libraries in other cases. What about performance? There are two kinds of performance we should really care about. One is the developer performance, and the other is the runtime performance. So what about developer performance? A developer performance is their productivity, their effectiveness, the speed at which they can develop. On the other hand, the runtime performance is how the code is when you actually execute it. Now, you would hear people tell you oftentimes that React has a better runtime performance. And you would hear people say that Vue has a better runtime performance. It's true only to a limited extent in my observation. Anything related to runtime performance, I always say it depends on the context. It depends on the type of data you deal with. It depends on how you structure your application. When it comes to developer performance, there are two ways to look at it. One is a large application versus a small or a relatively simple application. When you deal with a relatively small application or a simple application, I really like React and Vue to get the job done. If my application is very complex, and Angular may be a better choice. But again, I want to emphasize this. Just because I want to create something complex, that is not the reason I would make it large. I've actually worked very hard with clients where I've talked them out of creating large applications. They may still use Angular, which is fine. But as an example, I was talking to a company recently, and when we started, they said, we have a very complex application. And then I started asking them questions. In the end, we agreed when they used complex, what they meant was a capable application, not a complex application. The complexity that Angular can scale to is pretty large. And if you really want to build it, I would ask you to question that before you jump into it, because that's a liability you are carrying for a long time to build that kind of complexity into the front end of the application. And on the other hand, if you want to go that route and build all those bells and whistles and make a full-fledged MVC on the client side, Angular is something that says, I'm ready for you. I'll take on the load for you. It can carry that heavy weight for you. React and Vue, are really meant to create not a capable application, not necessarily a complex application. It's not that Vue cannot do that. It's not that you cannot do that with React using third-party libraries, but Angular is really meant for a different scale in that regard of complexity. And so developer performance-wise, Angular can take you further if you want to build a very complex application. Syntactically, it's a little bit weird, but in the case of Vue, you do binding using a single curly. In the case of React, you use a single curly. You use interpolation in the case of Angular. But Angular itself, as we saw earlier, has a few more things as well. And so in that regard, there is more syntax to learn in terms of Angular compared to React and Vue. There are more things you need to invest time on. For example, you need to learn about how to bind input, how to bind output, how to really configure routes. There is a lot of stuff to learn in terms of Angular. React and Vue have a few things to learn. One of the goals of Vue itself is to make us productive very quickly. So they don't have that many things to learn, and you can get up to speed relatively quickly and start building things with both React and Vue. On the other hand, if you're going to be getting comfortable with Angular, don't expect that to happen over a weekend. It may happen to you, but I'm not that good. It's going to take a lot more time to really get better at it. Well, that
Okay, we
brings
get
us
another
to...
question.
Yes, please.
The question is coming from Lee, and he asks, assuming I only have time to learn one new technology, which of the three is the most practical? I.e.,
I never answered that question. No, I'm sorry. You will never get that answer from me. I think it's a disservice to answer that question for anybody, and I wouldn't do that to anybody. And the reason is context absolutely matters. And if you have time to do only one thing, I would say go do something else. I'm not saying this disrespectfully at all, because if I'm a good architect, if I'm a good lead developer, I need to invest time in learning different things, because at the end of the day, I need to choose what is right for my company. I need to choose what is right for my organization. I cannot say, I don't have time. I learned one, and I'm going to use that hammer everywhere I go. Again, my intention is not to put down that question. I'm just emphasizing that because this is what my concern a lot of times is, that I go into companies where they've made a choice for the wrong reasons. And I spend more time questioning their decisions so that they arrive at a better decision. And honestly, I have built applications with every one of them. And that is because the projects I work with have a better need for one versus the other. And I would say it's a disservice. This is the same as selecting programming languages also, right? I program in 15 languages, and I do use different languages. I don't say this is the one language I'm going to use for everything. But that's exactly the same for frameworks as well, is I want to put these as pros and cons. And I want to say, here are the benefits, here are the disadvantages, here are the consequences, here is what we need. Let's pick the right choice. I think it would be a disservice to say, we are done. This is the one that we need to pick. Let's go home. I cannot do that. I mean, maybe there are other people who are really capable of doing that. I respect them, but that's not me. I cannot do that. Learning curve wise, huge investment. If you really want to think about it, Vue and React are relatively easy to learn. Angular takes a lot more effort to learn. Again, I'm not trying to say this to dissuade people from learning Angular. I'm just saying this because if you're a team and you want to get into using these technologies, don't assume you can just spend a weekend and be ready to use Angular. You're going to take time to learn, and it's an investment. And on the other hand, think of this like, learning a bicycle, learning to drive a car, learning to drive fly an airplane. Being a pilot, you're operating a bigger machinery, and pilots are very skilled, and they can drive this machine to go greater distances. But I'm not going to become a pilot on a weekend. I might become a bicyclist over a weekend, especially if I'm a really small kid. So think about it that way. This is a heavy machinery. It's going to take time for you to learn to operate that machinery. And once you master that skill, you'll be able to fly with it. These are not heavy machineries. These are cars and bicycles. You need to take some time to learn, but not as much as an investment to learn. But also the distances you can go with them varies based on what you're trying to do as well. And that's the pros and cons you have to decide to pick that up. In terms of migration from where you are to go into it, what is the path you're going to take? Well, the first thing, of course, is when Angular 1 was around and they came up with Angular 2, it's a bit of a disservice to even name it as Angular 2 because Angular 2 was completely different from Angular 1. The migration path is not easy at all. But I'm actually talking about companies that are moving from jQueries and JSPs and traditional Java applications to using these things. What kind of effort does it take? If your application is relatively lightweight, you would want to use a lightweight tool. If your application is extremely complex, or if your goal is to build a very complex application, then you may want to consider using something like Angular. So if you are...
Another question.
Please.
And this is coming from DJ Humphreys. And he says, if you were to learn all three again from the start, in which order would you choose to learn them?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard question to answer because, there are two approaches to take in this. One is, there's no really hard to answer because it depends on the person. Some people will say, learn the easy stuff, come to learn the hard stuff. This is purely personal. I always do the toughest things first because I usually have more energy in the beginning. And once I conquer the tough things, I do easy things later. And that's just been my philosophy of my life overall. I do hard things first and then take easy things later. And I'll tell you the order in which I learned stuff. I learned Angular first. That's where I invested most of my time. And I'm glad I did. And I suffered through it. I banged my head. I screamed. I cursed. Then I learned React. And of course, Vue came later. I learned Vue after that. And I'm happy with the journey I took. But I don't think I can say that's the journey everybody should take. It really depends on the learning style of the person. And there's no one right way to learn. Different people learn differently. Some people can learn the hard stuff first and then come back and conquer the easier ones. Some people want a milder, more of a manageable path, so to put it. Learn the easy stuff first. Now I understand that really well. I can conquer more things. So there's no telling how that is. But that's the path I chose. I can tell you what I did, but I'm not sure what I would choose if I were to do it again. Maybe I'll just do the same thing because I like to deal with complexities up front and then simplify things afterwards.
Chris over here in the comments has an interesting observation.
Yeah.
And they say, learn the one that you are most likely to use first.
Yeah, that's fair, but I don't know. That's also a problem. It depends on the context. If you're working for a team that's actually decided on a technology, that's an easy answer. But a lot of times, especially me as a consultant, I need to use different tools and different solutions for different clients. But if that's an option, absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. Go with the one that you would use. Or I would even give a counter point to it. If you're absolutely going to use it, hey, they're going to force you to learn it. So why bother? Go with something you wouldn't otherwise be forced to learn. Again, different perspectives, how you can want to look at it. I always say that, if you're using something at work, don't bother. They're going to force you to learn it. In your personal time, go learn something completely different. So, it depends on how you look at it. So migration-wise, that's something to think about. I talked about this already a little bit. Binding, Angular, and Vue can give you two-way binding. React gives you one-way binding. And again, it doesn't mean that that's a restriction. It is just that there are more bells and whistles. And to be fair, in Angular, there are two kinds of views that you normally can put together. One is the form that you normally use. The other is also reactive forms that you can use. Forms give you two-way binding. Reactive forms don't, because they want a better control over when the data is changed and when that change reflects in a component. So even Angular has kind of gone in that direction to give both options, wherein React only gives you that one option. It does not give you two-way binding, but Angular lets you choose it. In terms of MVC library, Angular absolutely is full-blown. It's very highly opinionated. Angular won't tell you do something and walk away. It'll follow you home and sit next to you and make sure you're following that. React doesn't have that kind of structure. You got to kind of impose that on yourself and your team. In terms of both Angular and Vue, they really are geared towards components and directives. Angular is all the way to the end. Everything is a directive in Angular. Every turn you make is a directive. You spend your life building directives and pipes and such. In the case of Vue, you focus more on components and less on directives. In the case of React, the concept of directives is rather weak. We don't do as many directives. We do very simple components. So there's a spectrum of complexity that you see. React is really light in that. Vue has a little bit more complexity, and then you can see an exponential growth towards complexity on Angular. You do a lot more when it comes to it. So that's a steep curve at that point. It's fun, don't get me wrong. I love learning about these things. I love building with these things, but it can be nerve-wracking and tiring sometimes as you tend to manage all these complexities. When it comes to Angular, there's a beautiful hierarchy and how you pass data between components, all that is baked in. And at some point, you will even question if that's the right direction to take, because that poses a lot of interaction. React, on the other hand, says, yeah, here's a way to communicate, but don't do it. Maybe just push that to Redux and let that really propagate the data. I've actually worked with clients where we have used Angular with Redux as well, so that we can easily communicate the data between components. And there's nothing wrong. You can choose that. You can choose to ignore parts of Angular and then use other lightweight approaches. We have done that in the past as well. That's basically about how we can interact between components. So we already talked about lightweight versus heavyweight. We talked about the dependency injection part. No dependency injection at all in the case of React. Well, that is not to say that you have tight coupling. No, that's not true. You have loose coupling. You can pass in objects around, but this concept of dependency injection per se doesn't exist as much in React. Vue, doesn't go much into it. Angular is baked with this idea. You could spend a few hours just learning about dependency injection in Angular. So to summarize what we talked about, which one should you use? Well, I'm going to say, well, that's your decision to make. I can't make the decision for you, but some of the things I would leave you thinking about is that you really are looking at a variation of power and complexity and ability. So if you want to build something relatively lightweight, relatively simple, React is wonderful for that. If you want to scale that a little bit further, Vue will not disappoint you at all. It will be able to support that. If you really, really want to build a very powerful and very complex application, that's the only time I would be looking towards Angular. Like I said, I've used them all, and I constantly go back and forth depending on the type of application I'm building for my clients. If they're building something where it is pretty lightweight, or if I can convince them to build something lightweight, that's a spectrum I stay with. If they have already committed to something very heavyweight to build, and they want something enormously powerful on the client side, then I work with them on Angular. And I go back and forth depending on what we are trying to do. And this also represents the learning curve as well. What's on this side here is relatively easy to learn compared to what's on this side. Takes a lot more time and effort to learn because there's a lot more to learn as well. And so it really comes down to that, right? Think of this. That's why I like this analogy of a cruise ship versus a sailboat analogy, because they are lightweight versus heavyweight, but also there's a lot more you can do in one versus the other. And so that's the reason I like this metaphor of cruise ship versus sailboat. Sailboat is lightweight. You can do a lot of fun things with in there, but there's a limit to what you can do. Cruise ship is very heavyweight. You can do a lot more when you're there as well and go greater distances. So you got to choose based on what your applications are. And of course, a completely separate decision is deciding what kind of application you really want to build. And this is where I spend most of my time with my clients, is to convince them that they, so to say, right size the complexity of their application and not go build a monster when they don't need one, or not build something capable and then come back and realize that they're stuck with something that's not going to be scalable in terms of the complexity they want. So that's a very important architectural decision that teams have to make. I'll be more than happy to take some more questions.
Actually, a couple of questions. First one that a couple of people have looked at asking is, would you please give a few concrete examples of what you would consider a complex and a lightweight application?
Yeah. So let's say a lightweight application is, you've got a few links on the client side. You got a few single page applications still, but you got a few links. You select on the links, a page pops up. There is not a whole lot of interaction in terms of hierarchy. So a page contains a reasonable amount of data. You don't have pages within pages within pages that you got to build this hierarchy into. That to me is a relatively lightweight. On the other hand, a very complex application is where you got not only links, but every link has sublinks, in turn can have sublinks. And you got this massive hierarchy that you're going to be navigating through. It's almost like a desktop application that you have ended up building on the Vue, on the front end. And so imagine the desktop applications of 10, 15 years ago, and you are trying to build that kind of capability onto your browser. And then when you open up a particular component, that itself contains very many number of components. I've actually worked with clients where they have 200 components, and components interact with each other in a lot of different ways. And you're just sitting there and saying, how do I bring them all together? And then your application environment is where you need to be able to very quickly bring in business units that needs to be integrated. So in a way, your application even works like a portal, if you will. And there could be things thrown into it, things that you want to remove quite a bit. That's where the complexity really comes of the application. Angular can scale up to that fairly well if you are going to invest the time into it. React is not that easy to go to that kind of complexity.
All right, very good. And another question, this is coming from Jonathan. He says, does it ever make sense to use plain vanilla JS plus DOM anymore?
It does. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it really comes down to what we are building. I'm extremely nervous. I constantly tell myself to not be prescriptive and adamant about a solution. I know good friends who would say, oh my gosh, you should never do any of these. You should build everything in plain vanilla JS. I've got friends who would say, you got to only do this and not these other things. Oh, you got to use this framework. It doesn't make sense to do that again. It's just not me. That's not the way I think. So I'm not going to say, no, you will never do. But I would say realistically, there will be limited number of times you would be actually doing. If you are trying to prototype some ideas, that may be a good opportunity. Or if you're building something extremely small, maybe even an internal application, that's perfectly fine as well. Honestly, on my side, I got a few applications that don't use any of these at all. I'll be absolutely frank about it. I've got a DSL, a domain-specific language I've written over the years. I've got a plain data file and I make the changes to those data files, run a script, and it generates HTML and JavaScript, and I push it. Sometimes people say, oh my gosh, how come this is so fast? And the answer is because it doesn't do anything. It's a bunch of static pages with a little bit of dynamic JavaScript in it. It's adequate for that application. Would I do that for everything? Definitely not. But at the same time, that's exactly what I did for that particular application. So the chance of me using plain JavaScript and HTML is slim, but not zero.
Very good. So that covers all the questions that we've had so far. Now, if you didn't get a chance to look at the polls, all 3 of them are open. If you would like to answer any of those, that would be great. We'll stay on the line for a little bit. I don't know, probably about another 5-10 minutes. How's that sound, Venkat, for questions?
Oh, I'll be here as long as you want me to be here. No worries at all.
And then we'll do the door prizes. So if you've got questions, feel free to put them in the question section, and we will field them as they come. Looks like you're getting a lot of thanks over there in the comments there.
Oh, thank you. I'm not keeping an eye on the comments, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's one of my favorite groups to be in. The only complaint I have is that I'm not able to be there in person.
Oh, next year.
Looking forward.
All right, I'll ask one of the questions that I've got that might be a little bit. Gregory says we'll send you a picture of the mountains, so the other side of the mountain range. One of the questions that may or may not be on people's minds, depending on whether or not they've heard you before, was this a shoes on or a shoes off presentation?
I'm sorry, repeat the last part.
Was this a shoes on or a shoes off presentation?
Oh, definitely shoes off. I think it'll be rude to lift my foot and show, but trust me, I don't have shoes. No, definitely no shoes.
All right, well, I don't have any other questions, so I'll move forward onto the door prizes. If there are questions that come up during the door prizes, then we'll answer those as well. So, oh, here's one. Hang on a minute. Let me get it in the question. So one of the reasons why I'm doing this for questions is I can actually tag them in the stream as being answered. So that's why it's taking a little bit of time. So Austin says, how have functional components and hooks changed your usage and or view of React?
Yeah, so honestly, I'm a little bit torn about it. I'm a huge fan of functional style, but at the same time, though, it appears to me that it is heading in a direction where I'm not convinced entirely that it is to the greater benefit for what I do. So I have to say that I'm still on the fence about it. I like testability a lot. I really care a lot about test driving my code. And in terms of being able to access a certain functions that I can test easily, the class model is much more easier than the functional model. Also, in React, when it comes to exception handling, there are some limitations when it comes to functional components compared to class components. So I'm still on the fence deciding, which one is better, and I haven't been able to make my mind yet.
All right, very good. Next question. This is coming from Andrew, and he says, have you seen any common patterns or suggest best practices for structuring React apps, even though it isn't required?
Yeah, so, and the answer is yes. And unfortunately, there is no standard for it. But this is probably where my Angular experience actually helped me a little bit when it comes to developing React, is I do create, I won't say a similar structure, that would be a stretch to say it, but I do have a component, I have a service separation, And so I do create a fairly decent amount of structure in React as well. And especially when it comes to talking to the backend, I use a lot of stubbing and mocking to take away access to the backend. And so from that point of view, creating a service separately has been a huge benefit in React. So I kind of follow the same approach as in Angular in that context, where I have components separated in a separate directory and services separated, and then bring in the services into my component, and that seems to have helped it. It's a lightweighter structure compared to Angular for sure, but definitely I have to say that Angular kind of influenced me to bring in some structure into React. I would definitely encourage that. But a lot of times this really comes through code reviews and refactoring, working with the team. And if we're a bit more receptive to ourselves and other people on the team, I think we can then start structuring it very quickly. I would say start writing, and the first time you have 2 or 3 things in place, get together and say, hey, how do we really structure this, and then tear them into different directories. And Vue is also giving you that kind of structure, so we can draw inspiration from those, and then it's not hard at all to do that in React.
Excellent. All right. Joshua asks, are you familiar with Svelte? Do you have any thoughts to share about it?
Yeah, I've kind of heard about it. I've not invested a lot of time into it. I've come across people who are excited about it, and that's to the extent I know so far. They seem to tell me that it's the next best thing since sliced bread, but I have to really invest time to see if it's actually true.
Very good. Let's see. I'll look at the ones that are upvoted first. From Gregory, what about other MVC frameworks, i.e. Backbone, Reactive, Dart, Kojo.js, et cetera, Are any of them worth learning?
We seem to live in this kind of phase where most of the things that were mentioned are used in production but are fading out. And so definitely most of those are probably not as exciting today to start on a new project. But having said that, I'll be absolutely frank about it. I use tools that have worked for me in the past really well, and I build applications with it. So I'm never ashamed of using something because it's fallen out of favor. I was talking to a friend of mine a few months ago, and he was using something, and I asked him what he's using, and he was very reluctant and said, I'm using this. And I said, no need to be ashamed about it. These are just technologies. Why should we ever be ashamed of using a technology, especially if it gives us value? So I would say absolutely, if you are using something and if you're absolutely getting value out of it, go for it. I never feel ashamed of using a technology. That's the last thing I think we should do as developers. I mean, I'll be absolutely honest about it. I use old technologies even today, and that's because I know them well. They produce results for me. I'm productive. So what's wrong with that? Absolutely, go for it. Would I learn them today to start using them? Probably not. But if I know them already, there's no reason to throw them away.
Very good. Next up from IM. Are any of the frameworks that we've covered better or worse for debugging?
Okay, so debugging wise, I am going to say I've had hard time with almost all of them. I always have trouble with the one I'm currently using for some reason. So all of them are equally evil. I do have to say that when Angular fails, I get very angry because it throws so many things at you that it can become really hard to trace where things are failing. Have I seen similar failures in React and Vue? I would say a little less annoying than Angular in that regard. But having said that, when I look at an error message, I kind of like, gosh, I don't have a clue where the error is. or not even what the error is. One of the things I've started doing more and more is, well, two things. One is to really test drive. And honestly, that has helped me a lot. So I write test and then I write code to make the test to pass. And when things fail, my failure is small rather than being big. And the second is also to develop in very small increments. I mean, I'm insanely incremental. I would, what I've learned over the years is that I am older but not smarter. Um, I write code, and sometimes when I say, "Oh, I can do this," and I write a little bit more code, and then it fails huge in front of me, I begin to realize that I was not smart. I was just kind of anxious. So I do that quite often as I build in very small increments. So when it fails, usually the context is relatively small, and I back out of the change and then take a step forward. And usually I'm like, oh, I know what went wrong here, and I usually fix it when the debug message is not that helpful. So I do have to say that it is annoying, and again, in terms of that complexity spectrum, the more complex it is, the more difficult the failure messages are. I've spent some times looking through the Angular's message, and I'm like, dear, I don't have a clue where in what part this is failing, and that can be really annoying. So yeah, absolutely.
Very good. All right, so the last question we've got so far, and this is coming from David, and he says, is No Fluff Just Stuff in Salt Lake City still planned for August, and are you still planning on coming because of COVID?
As far as I know, the answer is yes and yes, but we have to just see how things evolve in the next few months. But for all the things I know, the answer is yes and yes.
Very good. Hopefully that's the case, and we will see you in August then. All right, so that looks like that are all of the questions, at least for the moment. So I will go through and do the door prizes. Everyone should be able to see my screen, I'm hoping. Yep. So I'm going to mute your video for a minute, Venkat. All right, so we have the JetBrains licenses are going out to Brian Ivy and user JCB44CC ##, whomever that happens to be. And the Agile Learner subscription. Actually, Venkat, while you're still here, why don't you talk about that for a moment? So Justin, if he's not familiar, or anyone else that's here, gets to know what that is.
Yeah, sure. So Agile Learner is a video site that I maintain. Until recently, all it had was a bunch of videos, really short videos. Over time, I've had feedback from people saying, hey, I'm between meetings. I want to just come in and quickly understand a concept. So these videos are 5 minutes long to 20 minutes long. I think the maximum it goes is like 30 minutes long. So they're pretty short videos, mostly towards the 5-minute to 10-minute range. And you can listen to any videos. And if you ever listen to a video, it becomes part of your library. So even if you don't subscribe or continue subscription, you can still view them. And more recently, I started some live classes. In fact, I had one today. So these are 4-hour classes that I do on various topics, going deep dive, exercises, labs. And so these are live classes that I do, but mostly video. I don't remember the last count, but I remember well over 1,000 presentations on various topics: JavaScript, Java, Kotlin, Scala, Groovy, a lot of programming languages related topics, and design patterns and related topics. So that's what the site has.
Excellent. All right, so Justin, that's what you're getting, and all of these prizes, I believe, are all virtual prizes, and we've got emails, so we will send those out to the winners. The 3-month Pluralsight subscription that STG is giving is going out to Keniv Kanduk, and the Amazon gift card, I am sorry if I screw up your name, is going out to Jerome Broekhuizen. I think that's right. If someone has a better pronunciation or would mind correcting me, please feel free. So that is it for the door prizes. I will stop with that, and we'll put Venkat up for a minute to answer this question that came in the meanwhile. Okay, so this is from Matt, and he says, this is kind of long, how about a scenario where a large organization standardizes on one of these technologies so that they can provide shared components amongst the organization? However, when an organization decides to change the chosen technology, everyone has to rewrite everything in the newly chosen framework or library to get the new shared components. Do you have any suggestions on how to get code sharing in a large organization without being so tightly coupled to a specific library or framework?
Yeah. So sharing code, I think, is a terrible idea, especially for a large organization. It is a pathway to never being able to succeed. And I think that is something we need to really rethink about it. What would be better is to be able to share services instead of code. If an organization wants to have a business unit which is going to provide a service, kind of like going towards a microservices environment. So if my team needs to use a particular service, I can make calls into the service rather than trying to say, well, you guys give me the library and I'll integrate it and use it. I think that's an approach we have tried in the past, but I think we should not go in that direction. I think it's better to reuse services than to reuse library of code. Library sharing is a terrible idea in that context, I think.
All right, then. So that covers that. And let me see if I can find Brian. Again, if people have questions, feel free to ask them. Let me find Brian for our after session. Okay, let's bring Brian up. Alrighty. While Brian's coming up, once again, I'd like to thank Venkat for coming out. I'll show up on the video.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Here we go. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. And again, hoping to see you in August.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you all.
Yep. Thank you. All right. And here we've got Brian.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Let me figure out how to get my screen shared up here.
So while you're doing that, can you tell us? Here we go. What it is that we're looking at real quick. And
yeah.
On a note, do you want to be just the slides or your video and the slides?
Let's just do the slides. Or some of the slides have a little smaller font, so we get to them. I want people to be able to see it.
Perfect.
So I'm here to talk about a library I created, Metrics for J. But first, by just way of introduction, my name is Brian Hawkins. I work as a software engineer at Proofpoint. It's a company in Draper, and we do threat protection for our customers, mostly through email threat protection, but we do have a lot of different services. Right now, I work as primarily as a back-end engineer, and I work with and maintain and write code around large Kafka clusters that we have that processes billions of events a week. I'm also the creator of Kairos DB. It's a time series database on top of Cassandra, and that's why I'm passionate about metrics. So let's talk about metrics, because I love metrics. And if you reported metrics, you would love it too, because reporting metrics from your application will change your life, especially if you're the one that has to maintain your own software. A lot of companies will have operation people, folks that'll maintain it, but if you get escalated to you, metrics are a lifesaver. Diagnosing issues on large systems is just phenomenally easy with metrics. I got a little example. We had an issue just this week in the lab, and we have a Kafka cluster there, and the symptom was that Kafka was not closing sessions out. They weren't being cleaned out, and very bizarre problem. But it wasn't until we looked at the metrics and we brought up a dashboard that has metrics for our cluster, and we noticed one of the metrics shows which broker is the controller. And the metrics reported every minute, and every minute the controller changed. It was constantly changing. And when we went back in time on that data, we could see that yet it started happening about the same time people were reporting that they were having these session problems. Well, when it's a controller problem, I know it's a zookeeper typically. Their leader election is gone off. And sure enough, when we dug into it, we then found one of our zookeeper nodes got disconnected from the network. But here's a case where it was really fast to go from this to there, from the problem to a solution, especially when you have lots of machines, by looking at graphs of data that can show you data over time, and you can correlate that with things that go on. So metrics are awesome. But all applications should report metrics. I'm a firm believer of this, and it is getting better, but it's just not there yet. Part of it is, some applications report with JMX. JMX is okay, but it's not really there. You're really limited to just counters and gauges for the data that you can report, and trying to get the data off the box is a whole nother set of problems. You have to get additional software is required to either scrape the metrics or report the metrics, and then you have to deal with whether your JMX ports are open. You have to have security on the ports and this, that, and the other. It's a tough situation. It's not ideal. And I actually have a little solution for this. I'll talk about it at the very end. But there are some other libraries out there, but they'll tend to tie you into a specific time series solution. And for me, metrics should be as simple as logging. Everybody does logging in their code. Metrics should be the same way. So that's when I came up with metrics for J. It was inspired by an internal project at Proofpoint, and it's not tied to any backend. The source repository is under the KairosDB GitHub, but it's not tied to KairosDB at all. It's a very simple developer API. Think SLF for J, but for metrics. That's about as much code that you have to write to actually report things as if you're logging. It's very easy to unit test. There's a facility in it to pass mocks in so that you can verify when certain code chunks run that you've reported metrics and the right metrics from those pieces of code. It comes with a plugin architecture that prevents problems with dependencies from plugins from interfering with your host application. Anybody who's brought in a dependency that had Guava in it, and you've got Guava in your application, you know what I'm talking about. It's also, it has a powerful configuration that lets you customize the metrics at runtime. So let's get into a little bit more about the details in this. I've kind of separated, there's kind of two mindsets with metrics for J. The first one is the developer. That's the person writing the code and getting the metrics into the system. The second is the admin, the person that's running this application. Like me, I'm running Kafka. I'm the admin of that application. So for the developer, I made this so it's very simple. This is all you have to do to add metrics to your code, and you can do it in less than 5 minutes. You add the dependency of your project. You create an interface that defines your metrics, and I'll have an example of this in the next slide. But this is just a simple interface. Each method is reporting a specific metric for you. Then you request an instance of your interface from the metric source manager. This is very similar to like log4j, and you say the logger factor, give me a logger. You're doing the same kind of thing. Say metric source manager, give me an instance of my interface. And then the last is you add values to the collector that you get back from that. And that's it. It's very, very simple. Let's take a look at that and see what it looks like. So in this case, I'm getting messages coming in, or maybe I'm processing messages. I'm receiving a message in my service, and I'm doing some processing with it. So I want to report a couple of metrics. I want to report the size of the message that I get, and I want to report how long it took. So in this case, I create my interface, and I create the two methods, one for each of the metrics that I want to report. And I specify that the method returns a collector. Now in metrics4j, there's currently 4 collectors, 4 types of collectors. You have collectors for long, double, strings, and durations. And that's all you have to say. You say, I want this report size, it's a long collector. And then you see in the method parameters, I've annotated it with this key annotation that says it's a host. This lets me report a metric and tag it with additional data. And a lot of time series databases now support tagging to some level. And so this will add a tag to that data. So I can report, maybe I'm getting these messages from 2 different hosts, and I can then tag them appropriately. And then when I'm querying it, I can drill down to the data coming from a particular host. So that's it. That's my interface. I create that. I can create that anywhere in my project. Then let's go to the class where I actually report the data. So that's the next line there. This is in your static declarations in your class. You're going to say message source or metric source manager, give me my source. And I pass in the class of my interface that I've created above. And it's going to instantiate a class of that and hand it back to me as this reporter in this case. I call it reporter. Then in my code, wherever I want to report that value, I call report or reporter report size, call my method, pass in whatever tagging values that I want. It gives me back that collector that has one method on it, and it's put, and I put my message size. That's it. You're now reporting metrics from your code. Some of you may be thinking, well, maybe I haven't defined what message size is. Is it a gauge? Is it a counter? Well, that's the beauty of it. You don't define what that is. What the definition of that is and how that's aggregated is up to the administrator on the other side of things. So for this, it's super easy for the developer. So let's look at what the admin. Now this is where it gets more complicated. So the developer, they're done. They can add all these metrics. It's super fast, super easy. The admin, on the other hand, when they get the application, they're going to want to be able to customize everything. A lot of times we'll get applications, we're pulling metrics out of them. Well, they don't conform to the standard of the way we report metrics. We want certain prefixes or whatever on them. This is what the admin can change. They can change all these things. So first of all, the configuration is done within a metrics4j comp file. So you supply this file, you place it in the class path of the application. The format of the file is in HOCON format. It's a JSON, very readable JSON format. It's really, really quite neat. But in that file, and we're not going to get into the details. We don't have the time. I could spend probably an hour talking about the configuration options. But here's what you can do from the configuration file as the admin. You can specify what metrics you want to report. You can turn metrics on and off. So back in that case, I was reporting both the size and the duration. Maybe I don't care about the duration. It's giving me bloat in my back end. I don't care. I can turn that off. I can change the name of the metrics. I could say your company uses periods instead of underscores, or underscores instead of dashes to separate metric names. I can change that. I can create templates that change the name of my metrics to conform to whatever I want. I can add my prefix, whatever. I can also change how often the metrics are reported. Some cases you may have metrics that I don't really care to report that one very often. So maybe I have this report size, I report it every minute. But maybe I have another metric that reports a status of the server. I don't care to have that every minute. I'll report that one every hour. So I can change it up, and each one can be reported at different time intervals. Next, I can define how to aggregate those metrics. Now this comes in to kind of point I made out in the previous slide. Well, when I report the message size, what is that? Well, from the admin, I can give that a definition. Maybe I want to report that as a rate. And so I get every minute, I know how much data has been sent through the system for that last minute. Or maybe I want to report it as a counter, counting up the data over time, or a gauge, maybe a max min gauge. I want to know the maximum size that comes through the system over that minute or 10 minutes. Or maybe I want a histogram to give me more detail into it. All of that I can choose at runtime by changing the configuration file. And then the very last but not least, I can define where I send my metrics. I can use metrics for J comes built in with about a half dozen backends that it supports. But it also has the ability to put plugins for some of the heavier ones like Prometheus. And I'm not even confined to just one backend. Maybe I want to send my metrics to 2 different services. For example, what if I find Influx has a really cool alerting system, or Prometheus has an elite alerting system that I can use. But I don't want to invest in a long-term storage for Prometheus, but I want my metrics long-term. I can send my metrics to both Prometheus and Influx, or Prometheus and Kairos DB, or all 3. And that's all based on the configuration. Now, I kind of lightly glossed over this, but there's a GitHub project, and I've got all the documentation there. It's in metrics for J under the Kairos DB project on GitHub. And also I've created this is metrics, or the JMX reporter. It was kind of a proof of concept when I created metrics for J. It's a lightweight application that starts up as a Java agent, and it uses metrics for J to report JMX metrics from an application. We've used it on Kafka. I've used it on Cassandra. You just load it up in your command line, and it lets you have all the functionality and features of metrics for J. And if you have questions beyond the scope of what I can answer here, shoot me an email or post something on GitHub project. That was kind of fast and furious, but
right now, if you don't mind, Brian.
Yeah, let's go for some questions now. I kind of blazed through it because I know I'm the last guy on the totem pole here. So.
No worries. So Jared asks, how does metrics 4J compare with Spring Boot's micrometer?
Ooh, Spring Boot's micrometer. It's been a while since I've looked at that one, and I can't remember all the details. But this, I haven't seen anything that lets you get by with writing so little code as far as the developer goes, and gives so much power to the administrator who installs the application. That was my goal, is like, I don't want to write a lot of code, but I want the administrator to be able to change and control everything. And that's what you get with metrics for J.
Alrighty, very good. So if there are no more questions, we'll wait a couple of minutes. If there were no more questions, thank you everyone that attended this month's event. We're appreciative of everyone that's been here. If you have any other questions or comments for those of us on the board, we've got Don here in the comments somewhere, and Jonathan as well. And myself, Jason Porter, our 3 board members. If you have questions for us, want to give us some feedback or whatnot, you can email board@ujug.org, and we're happy to take any of those questions or comments as they come in. So once again, thanks everyone for being here. And I guess I probably should have toggled the video on that one. Huh?
Hey, well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Venkat, for coming out, and everyone else that's been here. Thanks a lot.